Welcome, everyone. My name is Adam Savitt. I'm Director of Communications at the Center for Security Policy. Welcome to the latest in our webinar series. Today's program is entitled, "The Chinese Communist Party is Our Enemy and What We Must Do to Defeat It." Before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. First, you are in listen-only mode, but you can submit questions in text on the Q&A panel on your GoToWebinar control panel. Send those over to me and I'll give it to the panelists. We will be recording the event. It will be posted on our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/securefreedom, and will be on our website, which is securefreedom.org. With that, I'll hand it over to my center colleague and the Vice Chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger China, Frank Gaffney.
Adam, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. We're delighted to have you with us. We are especially pleased to be able to bring to you, as part of an ongoing webinar series of the Center for Security Policy, another program of the Committee on the Present Danger China, which is a project of the Center. A man who was instrumental in inspiring that committee's recreation and who has been not only a founding member of it from the get-go, but also a driving force in its content and its amplification, is my friend and colleague, Stephen K. Bannon. Steve is well known, I think, to everybody in this audience, for sure. You may be familiar with some aspects of his background, most obviously the fact that he was the chairman of the Trump 2016 campaign during the critical period, would put the president over the top. He was also, for a time after that, the chief strategist for the President of the United States in the White House. But in addition to those pretty exalted accomplishments, he's been a naval officer. He has been a master of the universe, as they call these investment banker types at Goldman Sachs. He's been a very successful entrepreneur and filmmaker with, I lost count, frankly. It looked like 15 or 20 different films to his credit, including a personal favorite of mine about our mutual hero, Ronald Reagan, entitled "In the Face of Evil." We're going to be talking about another film that he's just recently done and so much more as we drill down on the topic today, which is the Chinese Communist Party is our enemy. And as Adam said a moment ago, and what can we do about that? How do we defeat that enemy? Stephen has given an enormous amount of thought to this over many years and has been really, as I say, not only instrumental in helping this entity that is really all about trying to make sure the American people understand that the Chinese Communist Party is our enemy and what can be done to protect our country and the rest of the free world against it throughout his distinguished career, and most especially at the moment when, among other things, he is the host of War Room Pandemic, which is a terrific online and broadcast product that focuses in intensively on topics that often relate to the Chinese Communist Party. So with all of that, let me simply say, welcome. We don't have Steve on camera. We're showing a maritime scene from a boat that he is on, but he's slightly off camera because the signal apparently is better. So we have him by phone, and I'm very, very pleased that we do. Steve Bannon, welcome to our home, if you will, our virtual space, the webinar with our very, very important supporters, as well as other interested members of the public. It's good to have you with us, sir.
Well, look, thanks for having me today, and I want to thank Frank, obviously, the Center for Security Policy, which I've worked with for seems like many decades now, both pre-Breitbart, after I did the film on Reagan, during Breitbart time, president, and obviously, today, and for helping start up or restart the Committee on the Present Danger and all the great work the committee's doing and the center's doing to really confront this existential threat, not just to the United States, but really an existential threat to the Chinese people. And now we see through the pandemic all of mankind. So I want to thank everybody for doing this, and really glad to be here.
Terrific. Thank you, Steve. And I neglected to mention, I've gone on and on, but of course, he was also the chairman of the Breitbart organization in the period after the passing, alas, of the man who started that incredible new media project.
Frank, that sounds less like a curriculum vitae or a resume, and to the left, more like a rap sheet. So.
Well, there are those who don't admire it as much as I do, Steve, but I know they're not in our audience. Hey, listen, I wanted to just share with you and our audience a story, Steve. I taped yesterday a 2-segment interview for our nationally syndicated radio show, Secure Freedom Radio, with Dr. Michael Pillsbury, who, among other things, is a very highly regarded expert on China. He's the author of The 100-Year Marathon, among other books. And he has become a very influential advisor to Donald Trump on matters involving China, his expertise, and related subjects. And he shared with me a really interesting insight. He said that the Chinese Communist Party has basically figured out how to run the table on us. They've got a strategy. They've been patiently pursuing it. They've been using a number of techniques from the Warring States period, including deception and using your adversary's strength against him and so on. And he said that the only concern they have is that some, sort of knuckle-dragging cranks, I think is kind of the way he was putting it, that they would regard as cold warriors, might try to screw up this great plan and deny them the position of world hegemon that they think is their rightful due. And he said, with considerable feeling, that the Chinese Communist Party considers you to be the preeminent cold warrior and biggest problem in this regard, and is therefore subjecting you to intense criticism and calumnies, of course, and the like. And I thought you'd find that gratifying. I know you've spent some time in China as the guest of the Chinese Communist Party. You might share some insights from that time with us, if you would, and your thoughts more generally about who we're up against.
It's interesting. Dr. Pillsbury is I think a fascinating figure. His and for your audience, if you have not read 100-Year Marathon, I strongly recommend you get it. It's really a kind of it tries to explain a book that's a little dense, but obviously must reading for national security professionals and a little dense for the general public. It's called Unrestricted Warfare. This was a book written in the 90s by 2, at that time, PLA colonels, People Liberation Army colonels. I think it's the most important book on strategy since Clausewitz, and it really lays out the 100-year plan of which they intend to become a world hegemon and basically crush the liberal democracies and all the essence of the Judeo-Christian West. Dr. Pillsbury, I think, has gone from someone who's, like many people associated with China and trying to write about China and study China. I'm not saying an accommodationist, but someone who's trying to work to try to build bridges and keep it coupled. And I think Dr. Pillsbury, his journey is every day goes more and more to be more of a hawk. I pride myself in being a super hawk, and that's got me a lot of attention a lot of attention obviously in the CCP. I'm honored to be considered public enemy number 1 there. And that's because of my relentless attacks that they're an illegitimate government. They're basically a mafia or gangsters. They've lied to the Chinese people since the very beginning. They've they promised land reform. They promised democracy. They've lied about everything. They've killed probably 200 million Chinese. They continue to oppress the Chinese people and underground Christians, Catholic Church, Tibetan Buddhists, the Falun Gong, Uyghurs, you name it, the democracy movement. So it is, and they know that the West is now waking up to this, and it's voices like Committee on the Present Danger, Center for Security Policy, many people that understand that they have decoupled from the West. They've decoupled from us technologically. They have decoupled from us financially now. And, this is a war. It's a hot information war. It's a hot economic war. And fortunately, right now, it has not gotten to a hot kinetic war. Although if we do not stand up to the Chinese Communist Party now and actually, support the Chinese people in taking it down, this will definitely segue into a kinetic war sometime, I think, in the not too distant future. So I wear that kind of as a badge of honor, Frank. And I think it's interesting. Dr. Pillsbury is one of the most prominent voices out there. And I think you see, if you watch him on Lou Dobbs, if you watch him on, I'm sure, your radio show, week by week, he gets more and more of a hawk. He's not quite maybe in the super hawk or ultra hawk category, Frank, that Brian Kennedy and you and myself and others, I throw Mike Pompeo and Peter Navarro in there. I think he's going to. Yeah, I think the super ultra, the Chinese Communist Party calls us super hawks. The Chinese people that support us call us the ultra hawks. So I'll take either one. But and they're friends.
What's interesting, Steve, is to your point about sort of Mike Pillsbury's transition, shall we say. In a way, the 100-year marathon is a story of his own coming to realize that those precepts of engagement that he had been, good with, if not a champion of, at least certainly comfortable espousing, has now really, as you say, the scales have fallen from his eyes, shall we say, and it's become, I think, the case for a lot of other people who were previously sort of seduced by the deception of the Chinese Communist Party. And it brings us to a point that I want to come back to, something you touched on a moment ago there. You said the Chinese have financially decoupled from us. I would argue that the single most important thing we've been able to do thus far as a Committee on the Present Danger China is expose, thanks to the work of one of our great friends and colleagues, Roger Robinson particularly, the reality that we may not fully understand the extent of the connection between the Chinese Communist Party and our capital markets, but they certainly see that as a huge vehicle for enabling much of the dangerous behavior that they've been engaging in and now have in prospect. And I wanted to talk to you about this particularly in connection with one of your most recent films, The Claws of the Dragon, which is about Huawei. And this is a company that's been much in the news of late, both because of its involvement in 5G, the fifth generation wireless technologies, and the Trump administration's efforts to really try to prevent the world from essentially embracing Huawei and its technology, its networks. But Steve, you've also helped clarify, the degree to which that's absolutely imperative because of the dangerous, espionage and data collection and manipulation of information that would enable. The Federal Communications Commission just yesterday declared Huawei a national security threat and has now blocked our carriers from using its technology and that of another Chinese company, ZTE. Talk a little bit about Huawei, about 5G, and about the importance of resisting it, understanding it as a national security threat. And oh, by the way, last point, the Pentagon last week actually said it is a People's Liberation Army company, or a Chinese communist military company. And for all those reasons, it shouldn't be in our capital markets, should it?
Look, we have both finance, our capital, and our technology has kind of created this Frankenstein monster. When I said that they've decoupled, I want to be specific. I was maybe too imprecise. Back in May of 2019, two things happened right after they had their first big One Belt, One Road conference. And that was they made a decision to decouple from us technologically, to go to their own standards, they would never again allow the West, as personified in the spring of that year by ZTE and even Huawei, to be beholden to the West either for component parts or for any part of the technology actually built. So they were going to go to their own technology standards. So the Zooms and the TikToks and everything in the future would be built to their standards and not to standards of the West to become the technologically dominant power in the world. Also, when I said financially, that's when they walked away from the Lighthizer-Trump deal. That deal had been negotiated for 18 months. It took care of what Peter Navarro calls the 7 deadly sins. These are the deep verticals of the subsidizing state-owned industries, of forced technology transfers, all the 7 things that the Chinese Communist Party has done over the years to really suck the vitality out of the West. They walked away from that deal. In fact, what this trade deal we have that President Trump was able to put back in the controversial part of the Bolton book is really President Trump trying to be a statesman and trying to get it back on track in Osaka immediately after they walked away. But let me pull the camera back for a second just so you put in perspective exactly what's going on here, because the Chinese Communist Party is the toughest enemy, the smartest enemy that the United States has ever had, and really freedom and the liberal democracies throughout the world have ever had. They have kind of 2 simultaneous strategies going. One is geopolitical and classic geopolitical lines. The other is by efforts and kind of lines of work. The 3 lines of work that converge is one is called One Belt, One Road, and that is a massive logistics system that they will connect Central Asia, Europe, and and Sub-Saharan Africa. Eventually the Caribbean and Latin America also, but to start with Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and Sub-Saharan Africa, in a logistics and market change back to China. Which the second part of this, Made in China 2025, is to make China the dominant power in the 4th Industrial Revolution and to make them the world hegemon as far as advanced manufacturing. That goes through a convergence of advanced chip design, artificial intelligence, robotics, and maybe even later on biotechnology. The last part of that is to dominate quantum computing, which is really the future of all technological change. And that is where Huawei comes in, both as a network and as a component, systems of network provider, and also as a components provider. So they've had that. That is a strategy they've been working on. They've been financing it. I kind of call it the particularly One Belt, One Road is the East India Company strategy run in reverse. Also, geopolitically, if you look at the 3 great constructs from the 20th century, Alfred Mackinder's the consolidation of the Eurasian landmass. He who controls Central Asia and the Eurasian landmass controls the world island. Who controls the world island controls the pivot of the world and eventually the world. Also, Mahan's naval strategy about choke points that the British Empire and then the Americans followed. I was a naval officer, and pure Mahan's strategy led to our victory in World War II in the Pacific and led us to become a great, the real superpower. The last is a guy named Speakman, which is about the rimland. And so the Chinese have done all that, One Belt, One Road, and this concentration on really consolidated the Eurasian landmass with their vassal state, North Korea, and their allies in Pakistan, in Iran, and their new ally in Russia, and I think of ultimately their ally in Turkey. So those countries, right, basically all of them dictatorships, are going to control the Eurasian landmass, force the West, and particularly the United States, off of there, forces back to Guam, out of the South China Sea, away from the Eurasian landmass, so we don't become we stop being a Pacific power and therefore have limited allies, limited access to Asian markets, and really limited to the growth of the 21st century. In Mahan's strategy, they are really replicating the United States Navy. They've built these essential aircraft carriers, which they call these fake islands in the South China Sea. They now have, whether it's the Straits of Malacca or the Hormuz of Djibouti, have all this. So this is a very sophisticated, very determined enemy on every aspect. They're doing this. And Huawei, what they've essentially done is had the West finance this. And, we've done it through our capital markets, and we've done it through our bond markets. We've done it by either looking the other way on the forced technology transfers. Remember, they steal about $600 billion a year of American innovation. And that's what comes from our research universities and what goes into our tech companies, et cetera. When they look back in history 100 years from now or 200 years from now, this period, we will be like the star of a Greek tragedy. Remember, in Greek tragedy, your greatest strength becomes your greatest weakness and what your enemies can turn against you. And here, remember, it's the money of the deplorables, which no one talks about. It's really the savings. It's the retirement funds, it's the insurance funds, it's the savings accounts of the deplorables that back the venture capital firms, that back the private equity firms, that back the hedge funds that have really financed our demise. And it's really part of the tragedy. I think if nothing else, the Committee on the Present Danger, through people like Roger Robinson and Kyle Bass and others, have just done an amazing job in less than 2 years to make this a front and center issue. And it's one of the big reasons that obviously guys in Wall Street and the City of London now push back on us. But I tell these guys when I talk to them, I said, look, traditionally we had 3 great capital markets. We had Wall Street, we had the City of London, we had Hong Kong. And just look at what's happening in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is the Czechoslovakia of our time. It's just like 1938. That was one of the world's great capital markets. It's being basically shut down by the Chinese Communist Party. And I think you can see right there what their intentions are, not just throughout the rest of East Asia, but the rest of Asia and ultimately the West.
Steve, that was a wonderful tour de raison. Let me ask you about the promised contribution we're going to make with this webinar, which is, what do we do about this? I want to drill down on what you said a moment ago about the Chinese using the deplorables savings to finance their activities, including the Belt and Road Initiative, including their efforts to dominate space, including their trying to, as you say, secure a dominant position in all of these technologies, and not least to bring them to bear to have a military that is not only quantitatively larger than ours, but qualitatively superior to ours as well, for perhaps ultimately the kinetic conflict that may be in the offing if we're not able to engineer another outcome. When you talk to your friends on Wall Street, I'm become a pal of, as you have, of course, of Maria Bartiromo, who does a spectacular job on Fox Business and Fox News, bringing to most of the rest of us information about Wall Street. And she said something fascinating the other day to the Attorney General of the United States, William Barr. She said she'd been talking to one of her guys, one of the Wall Street masters of the universe, about, why is it that they are so deeply committed to helping the Chinese financially? And this guy, sort of in a rather dismissive way, said, well, I'm not interested in picking good guys and bad guys. That's not my job. I can make money in China, and I'm going to do that. And Bill Barr, went right back at him and said, basically, look, if that had been the attitude of American business in the 1940s, we'd all be speaking German today. And he said, these guys have got to get beyond the idea that it's all about their next statement, going out on the golf course. That was the other thing he said. They got to get back to thinking about the national interest. And so, you've been there, you've worked with these guys. What's it going to take to cut off the funding to these People's Liberation Army companies? There's more than 20 of them, for heaven's sakes. And will President Trump step up to doing that, do you think?
Look, I happen to believe that in the last 4 months of this campaign, I think you saw from a tweet that happened last night with President Trump, I think you saw there was a protest for the first time outside the Chinese embassy today with about 100 Chinese Americans and Chinese refugees that said for the first time, CCP lied and Americans died on posters. And they said CCP lied and humanity is taking the brunt of it. The posters were quite amazing, and they were adamant about
20,000 of us, to be more or less precise. Stunning.
Yeah, 125,000, not one peep from the American people, and really going out. I mean, you're seeing it, but it's not at the fire breathing stage that you need. I want to go back to about the businessmen in the 1940s. They shifted in the 1940s because of Pearl Harbor, and they shifted because, quite frankly, things like the Defense Production Act. They weren't given any choice in the 1940s. Okay, they were patriotic, and we really stepped up. We became the arsenal for democracy, but that wasn't by choice. That was by dictate. Now there were many patriots, but in the 1930s, trust me, they were pretty open about. They were pretty, didn't care about who they were working with. Lenin famously
Henry
said,
Ford got a medal from the Third Reich for being so helpful to them.
Lenin was a quite brilliant guy. He said the capitalists will sell us the rope in which we hang them. And if you can see the streets, I have said this for many decades to donors, some of who probably remember I've said this. For years as a fire-breathing populist and economic nationalist, I used to get a lot of blowback from donors of the Republican Party. And I would always say, I said, look, your choice is not between me and Paul Ryan or me and the Heritage Organization, who I have a lot of respect for. I just disagree fundamentally on a lot of their policies. It's not between that. It's between me and the French Revolution, because that's coming, right? And I've said that for years, and I think many people on this call will remember when I said that, okay? Yeah. Remember, when Zhou Enlai met with Nixon in 1972 with Mao Zedong and Henry Kissinger, over dinner there was a slight lull in the conversation, and Kissinger, to make conversation, said to Zhou Enlai, "Sir, tell me, what are your thoughts on the French Revolution?" And Zhou Enlai looked at him and said, "Too early to tell." Right? They were in the middle of the Cultural Revolution then, and he was quite smart. He knew that these revolutionary movements would be about cultural Marxism, would be about destroying the basic substrate of the West, the family, our history, our heroes, and you can see it today on the streets of the United States. Now,
that's the point, Steve, isn't it? Yeah. Is it your view that there is a connection between the Chinese Communist Party and its long-term strategy for taking us down, and its revolutionary doctrines and Maoist People's War, and what we are seeing right now in the streets of cities all across this country, which, by the way, as our colleague Kevin Freeman has often pointed out, comes right out of that playbook that you described earlier, that unrestricted warfare. It gets right down to street violence and insurrection.
Look, we have to understand something. This is the most sophisticated enemy we've ever had. It's an enemy of everything we stand for. Remember, its number one victim is the Chinese people, is to keep the Chinese people down, right? They always keep them too hungry, too overworked. Remember, the Chinese Communist Party is just the latest manifestation of the imperial power of China. They've kept old hundred names, Lao Beijing, who is basically the deplorables of China, down for 4,000 years. The point of the Cultural Revolution was to follow the French Revolution and destroy what they call the four olds. Old customs, old habits, old ideas, old ways of life. That's exactly, Black Lives Matter, not the legitimate concerns of African Americans and Black Americans about Mr. Floyd and other aspects of racism in this country. I don't believe in systemic racism, but obviously issues with racism in the country. That is BLM, the underneath of that is obviously dramatically culturally Marxist, as Antifa is 100%. That's a Marxist organization, and there is to defeat the four olds. Now, my partner Miles Gross says no, it's not defeat the four olds, it's kill the four olds. They want to kill the family, kill your traditions, kill your laws, and essentially kill the American people and the idea of America. This is a war. We're at war with these people. This is not, and people say, oh, we're going to get to a new Cold War. You got to come. No. On the information, remember, there's three aspects of war, as unrestricted warfare says, and as Pillsbury outlines in his book. 21st century warfare is information/cyber war, economic war, and kinetic war. The Chinese are smart enough to know that they have a major disadvantage of us today with kinetic war. So they're going after information, cyber, and economic, where they think they have an advantage. Remember, information war, the deadliest weapon in mankind's history is the human mind. The human mind. And that's what information warfare is about. And we are engaged in a hot economic information war and a hot economic war. They are clearly, they're clearly, India, Modi, our great ally in India, and really the Michael Jordan of democracy, I think with 600 million votes. He banned TikTok the other day. TikTok, Zoom, Huawei. Remember, there is not, as Miles Gross said, there is not one technology company it is impossible to be a technology company in China and not be associated with one of three elements: either directly with the Chinese Communist Party, directly with the People's Liberation Army, or directly with the Ministry of State Security, which is a combination of the CIA and the FBI. All three of those are where
Steve,
both technologies are accessed. So they are at war with us, and we're just now awakening to that fact.
and some of us are. Some of us are still holding on to that engagement. It's just business, and we're not going to pick winners and losers, or good guys and bad guys. But I think increasingly, and thanks, I want to say, in part to your program, War Room Pandemic, you have done a huge amount to try to take the American people from a posture in which they have been assaulted. It didn't fit exactly into one of those three lines of attack that you're talking about, but make no mistake about it, folks, biological warfare is in the Chinese kit bag. It is part of their strategy. It is part of their capabilities. It's illegal, but there it is. And Steve Bannon, talk a little bit about the effects of the Chinese Communist Party unleashing that pandemic on this country, as you say, among others around the world, as a part of a larger strategy for weakening us and perhaps setting the stage for the mayhem in the streets, part of it engineered by outfits like, and I know you've talked about this on your program, the Freedom Road Socialist Organization and the Liberation Road, two basically Maoist Chinese Communist Party front organizations that have been intimately involved over the years in promoting and essentially enabling Black Lives Matter. Where are we on that piece of setting the stage, not just for the defeat of Donald Trump, but really taking down this republic very much in line with the People's War strategy of Mao?
Look, the reason we started War Room Pandemic back in January, but my colleagues and I do many broadcasts all the time with these channels that beam back through the firewall into China. And I traditionally do one over Lunar New Year for 2 or 3 days. It was in mid-January that people started telling me, hey, the Lunar New Year is going to be canceled. I said, what do you mean canceled? You can't, it's 500 million people travel. And it's really the legitimacy of the regime is based upon travel and economics and having people be able to actually try to make some material advance. And they said, no, it's because of this, what's coming out of Hubei province. And that's when, given my years in China as a naval officer and as a businessman, I realized that they were going to shut down Hubei province, which is the size of France, and quarantine Wuhan, which is the size 40% bigger than New York City. And when I say quarantine, I don't mean walking around in a mask. I mean inside your house, locked in for many, many weeks. And I said, this is significant for the regime to do this. This is serious, right? And so we started covering this every day. And I said, look, it triggered a global economic crisis of which the world's never seen. I think it's the biggest economic crisis in the history of mankind. And on top of that, a capital markets and financial crisis that we, having now increased the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, I think by $6 trillion, don't even know what the long-term ramification is. We kind of gone to modern monetary theory when they're talking about another stage in this bridge could be $1 to $3 trillion, depending on if you're a Democrat or a limited government Republican. So these things are of scale that we've never seen before. Now, my colleagues, and I'll give you another book, General Robert Spalding has written a book called Stealth War, which is really also trying to explain unrestricted warfare. General Spalding was the most brilliant guy we brought into the White House. He was on our China team. He's now out independently. He's part of the Committee on the Present Danger. He does our show a lot. General Spalding and other colleagues that I admire think that, hey, this was a planned biological warfare attack. They realized during the negotiations of Trump with trade that we were becoming awakened to what they were trying to accomplish, become a hegemon, and they decided to strike first. Now, I don't quite take that hard a line. I think it came out of the P4 lab inadvertently. But regardless of whether it was a direct biological weapons attack, regardless of whether it seeped out inadvertently, we know from the chain of title of their decisions that as soon as they understood that this thing was out of control in central China, they exacerbated blowing this out through the rest of the world, whether it was through northern Italy and the fashion show and the fashion things in Milan, in the Lombardy region and Turin, and then ultimately to the United States or into the West Coast, where having people travel at the same time, to sweeping up all the PPE throughout the world, understanding that would be the gating event for how many people died. They've exacerbated this, and they've used it as a weapon. And remember, biological warfare, this is when I talk about kinetic war. Chemical and biological warfare are at the top of their game more than nuclear, right? They are actively, they have an
pulse as well.
Electromagnetic pulse. This is an enemy. And the other thing you got to remember, and I've known since knowing Miles for a couple of years, which kind of shocked me, because if you look at their history post-Civil War, where they lost 40 or 50 million people in the Great Leap Forward. They lost another 50 to 60 million people in the famine that created. They lost 50 to 60 million people in the Cultural Revolution. He thinks they lost 2 or 3 or 4 million people in Tiananmen Square over a whole nation. He says they do not mind. Mao and Xi and these people, if they lost 100 or 200 million Chinese, it would not be the bat of an eye. They could care less. If they lost 100 million Chinese because of some sort of biological weapons problem, they wouldn't matter. This is their, I believe, their biological Chernobyl, right? Mm-hmm. And they have spread this throughout the entire world. And with social media and other, this is now an organized effort to really go after the West. And you see, when they think they have a problem, they will lock down Beijing. But they have no problem spreading this throughout the world and trying to get it spread throughout the world. They are actively, and this is what is so shocking about the permanent political class in both London and in the United States, is that it is still in business with these guys. There is a book coming out. I'm proud to announce, it's the first time I announced it, the Rule of Law Society that I'm the chairman of, and the Rule of Law Foundation, which Kyle Bass is in charge of. We're trying to bring the rule of law to China. We are both sponsoring it. It's a gentleman named Clive Hamilton. He's an investigative reporter who wrote a book about 5 years ago called Silent Invasion, about what the Chinese Communist Party did in Australia, buying up companies, all these natural resources coming, buying up agricultural land, bribing politicians, virtually almost came to a total takeover of Australia until his book came out, and they've been able to reverse it. I would actually argue that Prime Minister Morrison is there because of this book and the Australian people waking up to how far gone they were with the CCP. He has a book that's coming out called Hidden Hand, and it is about the global reach of the Chinese Communist Party, particularly in London, New York, and Washington, D.C. It's right. Explosive. Here's how explosive it is. The Chinese Communist Party, with people who are named in the book, are trying to stop publication of the book in September in both London and in the United States. We're going to defend that and go after it. They've already shut down every major publishing house from touching it, and that should be a thing of people in America should wake up, but it's going to be published in Canada. And he names names of the political apparatus that has looked the other way. Look, the party at Davos is in business. They're the financial and technological partners of the Chinese Communist Party. And this is just, it cannot be allowed to stand. If we allow this to stand, we'll be definitely be enslaved by these people. And I'm not being over the top of there. Just look at Hong Kong.
Look at Hong Kong. And I just want to put a particular face and name in this sort of globalist Chinese communist axis, and that would be Larry Fink of BlackRock, who has amassed immense wealth through his work with the Chinese, among other things, who is not only a hugely successful master of the universe, as I say, on Wall Street, but also has got now his hands on the spigot of, by some estimates, most of $6 trillion that the public treasury has now been making available to try to prop up our economy, and he's putting a lot of it into these kinds of transactions and companies and indexes and ETFs and so on that are doing business with and helping prop up the Chinese Communist Party. It's a scandal. But Steve, I want to take some questions from our audience. Just as we transition, make 3 points, if I may, and maybe you can amplify on them in response to some of these questions. In terms of what we need to do about the threat posed to us by the Chinese Communist Party, it seems to me obvious, and I think from what you've said, it's clear to you as well, we've got to stop underwriting it, with particularly the money of not so much the Larry Finks of the world, but American, hardworking investors and taxpayers. Secondly, that we need to penetrate, and you've been doing this with your War Room Pandemic and your films and your other efforts, the firewall, the Great Firewall of China, as it's called, the effort to prevent the Chinese people from knowing the truth about the outside world, brainwashing them and ensuring that they are socially engineered into hating us and perhaps waging war against us. And finally, it seems for all of those to ultimately be successful, we have to have as the object of our purpose here, just as Ronald Reagan did, and you documented this brilliantly in your film In the Face of Evil, taking down the Chinese Communist Party, the liberation of that country from its evil in our time, in the existential threat that flows from it. Let me hit you with a couple of quick questions, Steve, if I can.
Hold, before we do the question, I guess very quickly, and I'll make sure it's quickly. Reagan, this is important. In the early, when Reagan came to power and ran for the presidency, remember he lost the first time as running in '76. At that time, and as a young naval officer at the Naval War College, the correspondence course, you studied the Peloponnesian War. Why? A nuclear theoretician named Graham Allison and Henry Kissinger had come up with this concept that the Soviet Union was a rising power, that they were stronger militarily, they had a command economy that was working. Ours was all upside down from the Arab oil embargo. The West was each other's throats. The United States was highly inefficient. When President Reagan won, he had a philosophy. How about this? We win, they lose. And he had Andy Marshall at the Net Assessment Group inside the Pentagon and Bill Casey, a Wall Street lawyer who took over CIA, do a reassessment of the economy. And it came out that the intelligence services and the Pentagon and State Department for years had just miscalculated grossly the Soviet command economy. In fact, only half the size of ours. And so through economic warfare, which was the defense budgets, the 600-ship Navy, which never got built. Frank, you were there. You were one of the guys that helped drive this. And eventually Star Wars, using, guess what, our technology and our capital to defeat. And I remember the CIA analysis came out internally when I was an aide to the Chief of Naval Operations in the Pentagon after sea duty. In 40 or 50 years, they would collapse. Well, it took about 8. Okay. So the same guys, the concept for the audience.
Steve, it took about 8 because there was a concerted effort made. And I want to just also say, by the way, folks, that in addition to the men that you've mentioned, Andy Marshall and Bill Casey, great hero, working through and acting on 2 things. One was the visionary alternative approach. You're right, the president called it, we win, you lose, but it was basically the strategy of what? The Committee on the Present Danger that helped Ronald Reagan, one of its members, articulate and ultimately get a mandate to take down the Soviet Union, which he proceeded to do with the help of other members, including Bill Casey. The point is that we're in similar time now, and let me just segue to one of these questions, Steve. We've got
but hold on, right before we get there. No, hang on. But the construct we've had as a country now for 20 years, things called Thucydides' trap. The same 2 guys, Graham Allison and Henry, we're the declining power, and they're the rising power. Here's the difference. That's why Trump is president of the United States. The managed decline by our elites is what brought the populist working class people, and that's the Bernie people that voted for Trump, that got him the victory. They refuse to believe in American decline. Here's the thing: we're not the declining power. We've just been acting like it. I had Graham Allison at my house, and I asked him. I said, "Brother, I went through all the book many times. Your 14 examples of when this has happened. Not once has the elite of the declining power made this much money in assisting the rising power." That's the difference. It's the managed decline of our elites that have brought us to this moment in history. And that's why working class people, and it's their money. That's the Greek tragedy part of it. It's their cash that's led to their own demise.
So let's talk about one of the questions, Steve. We're in a moment, not unlike 40 years ago, when the President of the United States is now challenged by a great and very deadly adversary. This one, you're absolutely right, is far more so than the Soviet Union was. In that period, of course, the President of the United States was part of the manage the decline crowd. He was with détente. He was with engagement, as it were. This president doesn't feel that way. This president, I think, if anything, as you've indicated, is becoming even more robust about the nature of the Chinese Communist Party and the need to resist it in the closing days of this campaign. Do you anticipate, Steve Bannon, that President Trump will make, once again, the Chinese Communist Party, the existential threat to freedom that it represents, and the need to take a we win, you lose sort of strategic approach to this existential threat to freedom in this election cycle as it reaches its denouement?
It's very simple. If he doesn't, he's not going to be reelected president of the United States. I don't think there's any doubt about that. If you do not confront what the Chinese Communist Party did to him, he sits there and continues to talk about the great economy and the deal. And he's absolutely correct. I think he's now just becoming aware because, remember, he's tried to be a statesman. He's tried to become engaged. He doesn't want to have a situation, particularly in the pandemic, where they're not sharing information. Well, I think after Hickam Field meeting with Pompeo, we realized not only are they not sharing information, they're hiding information, and the information they're putting out are lies. Yeah, what they do is they put out falsehoods. I think the president is now coming to the realization that they are an enemy of his administration. They understand, besides all their happy talk, they have to get rid of Trump. Now, the key for what we're trying to do is build a national consensus, particularly among working class people, that they're an enemy of the United States. We definitely need the Democrats on our side. I mean, Nancy Pelosi came into politics as a fire-breathing democracy movement, Tiananmen Square, back in the 90s. I think she was almost arrested in Tiananmen Square. Now, because of the Trump derangement syndrome, she wanted to come to the side of the party of dissidents that want to take down the CCP. We have to build a consensus. However, Joe Biden, they could not have selected a candidate that has a worse record, and here's why. President Obama knew that something was up. The whole pivot to Asia, which is the centerpiece of his foreign policy, was to get out of CENTCOM, get out of the Middle East, and pivot to what the problem was. He put Joe Biden in charge of that. Joe Biden was a disaster on every level. One, he's just not tough enough or sophisticated enough to go up against Wang Qishan and Xi. I mean, these are, as President Trump says, tough hombres. Okay, you have to be a hammer. You have to be a Pompeo. You have to be a Cotton. You have to be a Trump. You have to be a Navarro. You have to be relentless. You can't be fooled by them. That's where the Lighthousers, these guys have been so really godsends to us. And Biden got played. In addition, he is compromised. And I don't say this lightly in questioning a guy's patriotism, but he is what he's what the Bolsheviks and the Marxists call a useful idiot. Mm-hmm. He has been used by the Chinese Communist Party. But Obama had him to focus on two things: cyber intrusions into American business and stealing intellectual property, and the militarization of the South China Sea. She came over and signed a document in the Rose Garden in an official state visit that promised that both of those were going to go away, negotiated by Joe Biden. 6 months later, there are more cyber intrusions than ever, and they've totally militarized the South China Sea. They understood that Biden was a fool. Biden is the equivalent of Neville Chamberlain in Munich in the 30s.
One other manifestation of that foolishness and reckless disregard for the national interest was, as you know, he also was responsible for engineering a memorandum of understanding with the Chinese Communist Party that essentially enabled them to get a pass on all of the rules and regulations of the laws of the United States, the accounting standards, so that they could get access to our capital markets without having to play by the same tough standards that our own companies are. This is outrageous. And it brings me to another quick question, Steve. When you look at what needs to be done here and the challenge that is now facing not just the United States, but I think from your opening comment, you made the point that it's the whole world that is under assault from the Chinese Communist Party. One of our audience members wanted to know, are we likely to be able to forge, despite the penetration, despite the influence operations, despite the Belt and Road Initiative, despite the Huawei, digital hegemonism, are we likely still yet to be able to build in the free world a kind of, countervailing alliance that can, in fact, defend freedom and prevail?
I call it the Alliance of Liberty, and it's alive and robust. The good news is on our side of the football are freedom-loving people, right, that understand the benefits of freedom and the hard work it goes into. The greatest example is India, which was part of the Soviet spear back, as Frank, as you remember, in the 60s and 70s. Modi is a hero. 600 million people, and the Indians, and particularly the nationalists in India, 100% are on our side. That's why they're up in the border right now, with Pakistan and China on what is occupied Tibet. You know, they've got a couple of combat divisions up there. That is an area of friction,
and now
just like in the South China Sea.
Yeah,
orders to shoot. The littoral nations of the South China Sea, including Vietnam. Vietnam is one of the fire-breathing allies of the United States and Japan. They're looking for leadership, and President Trump's giving leadership. Look, as a guy when I was 21 or 22 years old on patrol in the destroyer in the South China Sea, we have an American president that's more engaged in the Pacific than anybody since FDR won the war in the Pacific, even more than President Reagan, who really kind of had to focus on the Soviet Union. The key is to make sure that we understand that Iran and Pakistan are allies to the Chinese Communist Party. You can't just look at Iran and these things as standalone. When we look at it that way, we have an alliance of liberty. And from sub-Saharan Africa to Latin America, people want to be on our side, and President Trump's doing that leadership. Now it's time to say, hey, game on, right? We want to avoid a kinetic war because we don't want 200 million people dead, and that's what will end up happening. Right, you'll have 1 billion people dead. If we go to a third world war, there will be 1 billion people throughout this world dead. We want to avoid that, and we can avoid it by this is Munich in '38. And Hong Kong is that place. You confront them in Hong Kong, and what I mean is sanctions first, primary sanctions, secondary sanctions, cut them off the capital markets, decouple from the Hong Kong dollar, play smash mouth. And I don't care if the stock market goes down 10 or 15%. The stock market will come roaring back when we have a new government. When that regime gets overthrown by the Chinese people. Remember, the West cannot overthrow the Chinese Communist Party. Only the Chinese people can overthrow the Chinese Communist Party. It's the reason the firewall is so important. If we were to take down the firewall, which is 100% within our purview to do, and I think you're going to see people like Peter Navarro and Mike Pompeo come out with Michael Pack and be fire breathers on taking down the firewall, the Chinese people will take down the Chinese Communist Party in 6 months to a year. Remember, there are many people in China, including members of the Chinese Communist Party, that understand it can't go on like it's going on. They understand what they did with this weapon. They understand what they did in Wuhan. They've understood how cold and cruel they are to the Chinese people. And so, but we have institutions in the West, from Wall Street to the City of London and the Vatican. Remember, the Vatican has a secret deal with the Chinese Communist Party that's outrageous. They would not reveal this. And Miles Grothe, they called him out. He says, you know why they got the secret deal? They've been paying billions of dollars to the Vatican under the table. And the Vatican has not come forward and denied that. And he called him out the other day, said, hey, if you think I'm lying, sue me. I'll go into court and I'll show you the documents, and I want to do discovery on you. We have institutions in the West. We have institutions in the West that have been corrupted by money and influence peddling by the Chinese Communist Party. It's time to call it out. By the way, these are actions that have to be taken. We have to take down the firewall. We have to cut them off from all access to American capital. We have to delist all their companies. We have to pay these railroad bonds. They owe the American people about $1 trillion for these Chinese railroad bonds. We got to either get them to pay it or take their own debt and flip it in for it. We must. Every aspect of technological transfer must stop. And Huawei, ZTE, TikTok, Zoom,
our supply chains, obviously.
Bring back the medical supply chain immediately. Incentivize our companies that they must, and they won't have an option, must bring the manufacturing supply chain. We have to become the leader of the fourth industrial revolution. It's all coming out of our research universities and our weapons labs. It just happens to get transferred to the CCP through various means.
Thousand Talents program. And
Thousand Talents. If we stop. Listen,
and this goes back, Steve, to that point about if you've got Chinese People's Liberation Army companies operating in the United States, doing joint ventures, putting their personnel into some of these research labs, doing mergers and acquisitions, your old line of work, with American companies that get them around, our Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States and the like, we're really creating a vehicle for precisely what you're talking about, not just penetration, not just influence operations, but wholesale technology theft, intellectual property ripping off, and not least subversion. And by the way, folks, this is something that every Chinese company, every Chinese national is obliged to do on demand of the Chinese government under the Chinese intelligence law.
By law.
But on
By
top
law.
of it,
Last,
the People's Liberation Army has it as their mission, for heaven's sakes. So what do we expect?
Last thing I want to say is the Chinese people, the Chinese Communist Party says they're too dumb, they're too barbaric, they're too chaotic to govern themselves. They can't have democracy, they can't have the rule of law because they've proven over history it just evolves into chaos and warlordism. If you look at the Chinese people in Canada, the United States, Europe, London, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, you give the Chinese people, the decent, hardworking people of China who are family-oriented, law and order oriented, if you give them democracy and the rule of law, they prosper. It is their liberation. They're the only ones that can bring about their own liberation, but we can't continue to finance their oppressors. If we stop that, they will free themselves. And the world will have nothing but sunlit uplands after that. Okay, that's what stops us. That's what's going to shut down the radical part of BLM. That's what's going to shut down Antifa. Obviously, we have to work through our own racial issues, and we have a lot of work to do. Okay, but the radical cultural revolutionary Marxist underpinnings of that can all be done away with. This is the challenge of the 21st century.
Party. No, you're absolutely right.
Yes, whoever frees the Chinese people are going to write, whoever helps the Chinese people free themselves is going to write the history of the 21st century.
That's right. And if God help us if they write it. Let me ask you just finally, Steve, and very succinctly, if you will. You've described that President Trump wins if he makes China and the liberation of China from the Chinese Communist Party his central platform for this election. What happens if Joe Biden, or let's be honest, whoever is the vice president under Joe Biden, and God help us who that might be, but if they wind up getting elected instead of Donald Trump, how does this look a year from now?
It depends on, I happen to think, look, I think if President Trump's not reelected, it's catastrophic for the country. It's catastrophic for generations to come. And almost as importantly, catastrophic for the memory of the great patriots that bequeathed this great nation us, because I think we've become something else. Look, we're in a fourth turning, just like the Revolution, the Civil War, the Great Depression, World War II. The next 10 or 20 years, America is going to come on the other side that either be the country we love, or it's going to be something totally different. And Trump's election to me is essential to that. However, if we do lose, I think that in bringing this to the American people and hammering it every day, we build an opposition that we're relentless. We, just like Reagan and these guys were in the out years. Remember, Reagan, I think, did his greatest work in keeping a group of patriots together, led by the Committee on Present Danger, said, hey, these guys are evil and they have to be defeated. It's no rapprochement. It's no détente, right? It's no working together with them. They're bad and they must be defeated. That's what we have to do. And if we have enough patriots in this country, and here's what we got. We have enough working class democratic patriots that are going to come to our side. If we continue to demand economic nationalism or bringing back those supply chains from the Chinese Communist Party. Look, if President Trump doesn't win, it's going to be very, very tough, and this country is going to go through some very bad times. But if he loses, if President Trump wins, don't think that the radical cultural Marxists are going to go away. They're only going to increase in power 10 times. So we have 10
especially
years
if the
of
Chinese
struggle.
Communist Party is unchecked in supporting.
This is my point. We have a decade, and this is my point. Sunshine Patriots, the guy says, hey, I just care like making money. Fine, dude. You're going to be weighed and measured in history. And not just that, you're going to be judged by Almighty God at some point in time. Okay? I am dedicated to leave it all on the field. As imperfect an instrument as I am and President Trump is, right? Leave it all on the field. And this is my point. This is the great challenge. This is the next great challenge for America. And I think you can see from the last 6 months, it's the greatest challenge we've ever had as a country, because it brings so many forces together. We have to prevail on this. There's no other choice. We got to march or die on this one. So I think if we win, it's going to be tough. But
Steve Bannon,
if we lose,
we appreciate so much your time. I'm sorry to talk over you as you're wrapping up, but I think your point is very well made. It comes down to a choice for the American people of freedom or enslavement. and it will entail our defeating the Chinese Communist Party, our time's existential threat to freedom. Steve Bannon, we thank you for your leadership on this. They may hate you, but we love you, and we know that you're on the right side, and we're glad we're on it with you. Thank you for your help, particularly with the Committee on the Present Danger of China, which is made possible by the support of people like those listening to the Center for Security Policy, for which we're also very grateful. Thank you for the great questions and for the chance to visit with all of you. And we look forward to doing this again soon. Steve, take care, my friend. Be well. God bless you all.